you said something that was interesting in terms of the, where AI is going, and what does it bring to the world today, and comparatively, it is the game changer. And when we look at technology, I don't remember the which book it was. I keep thinking it was The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth, but I don't think it was. But he was just talking about technology and the shift. So I didn't know this until I read the book. I probably hadn't thought about it. But what was the one invention that actually was the biggest change in humanity? And people often go, "Oh, it's a steam engine." Nope. It was cars. Nope. Wasn't any of that. It was actually the printing press. And the printing press is what allowed knowledge to expand literally, seemingly overnight, which meant that, number one, they were, hand printing Bibles at the time. This allowed them to, hand writing Bibles at the time. And this allowed them to mass print. But then that turned into, well, hold it, I've got a philosophy on life. I've got science. I look at the stars. And the next thing you know, all of these really, quite advanced, smart people back in those days were able to share their knowledge. And then, of course, out of that came, schools, universities, and so on and so forth. And so that led to things like, the understanding of cars and driving. And then everybody goes, well, the car was a big deal. And it's so fascinating to watch the evolution of some of these things. And I'm just talking about certain moments in time, is that the car was cool, but then they realized that, you needed tires. And then Michelin came out and said, well, we need tires to go other places. Well, when you have a car, you need some place to drive to. Out of that came parks. Out of that came suburbs. Out of that came other places to drive to. And then that expanded the world. So it's all to say this. There's some really cool things in our history that seem to be monumental. This is one of those times. I believe that, with technology the way it is today, with AI, I really do. Robotics, all the things that play into that. I think this is that. I don't know if that's part of the fourth turning, but it's just that. It really is that shift in society. We talk about cars just quickly. I know I digress, but we look at it today, and I just talked about writing. I maybe hire writers, or I may hire copywriters. Back in the day when cars came out, there was the famous quote that says, if God would have wanted, to get places faster, he would have bred faster horses, whatever the comment was. That's where they were stuck. But as cars came out, what it did was it put a lot of blacksmiths out of work. All of a sudden, horse and buggies, the buggies didn't need to be built. We didn't have horses to shod. It was like all of a sudden these things changed. Today, when we look at AI and you start to consider the jobs that it fills, there's a lot of people that are going to have to go, I got to reinvent a career, or I've got to study differently. And I say that only because, like I say, you've got that background in technology. How do you see it going forward? Do you really see the evolution of us as a society going, yeah, no, guess what? You're not going to be doing any of that anymore. This is where we're going. Do you have any kind of insights that you would share in that regard?
Yeah. So, I oftentimes will scoff a little bit about the Henry Ford quote that you gave, that if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. I don't actually think that that's how it would have gone. I think, any smart product manager would have asked a follow-up question, and that's why. Like, why would you want faster horses, and trying to drive the outcome? And then, yeah, you may have landed on the automobile, right? I think that this is a slightly different situation, because right now what we're creating with AI are faster, smarter, far more effective humans, right? Or a replication of what our human brains can do. There are a lot of people who say, well, you can't, clone the empathy or the rapport that you absolutely will be able to do that. Like, it might be another year and a half, right? It's not far off, and we're often there already. Like, there have been cases that I've even seen in the news where, there have been fake kidnappings with real ransoms, where people have cloned the voices of their loved ones.
I know.
And things along those lines. So there is a way to create emotion from artificial intelligence. Absolutely. I actually have a different prediction. I think it will likely be the end of a you have to work for a living society. It's very strange to say it because I am a big proponent, always have been, of capitalism.
Mhm.
I don't know if I see capitalism surviving in the same way as it otherwise would. I think that we're destined for, if we continue to allow this trend on a governmental and regulatory perspective, we're definitely destined for a world with a lot more, likelihood to go to like a UBI, universal basic income sort of realm. I do think you're still going to have innovators with the option of creating value, but I don't think it's going to be a requirement for much longer for most people, especially the people who are knowledge workers, who are decision makers, who are creators in any capacity, artists, entertainers, actors, thinkers, engineers. All of those people with this technology are likely out of work, or at least a dramatically different work here soon. One of the pieces of technology that you brought up, which I think is very, very important here, because right now there's a kind of a subsect of engineering that's popping up in AI called prompt engineering, right? You're figuring out what to prompt AIs, like generative AIs, the current form of generative AIs, in order to get the correct outputs. I think that that is just a bridge to a promptless AGI, right? So, like through that lens, I actually don't believe that we're gonna be in a place where humans have to work to live. I think it's going to be very strange when that happens because if you would have looked at humanity 150 years ago, you likely wouldn't have a lot of human beings that were having a lot of time to think and talk about things like purpose and fulfillment. They were focused on survival, right? They were focused on making sure they could pay the bills and just have a clean, safe place to sleep and to raise their kids and so forth. We're now at a point where we have the time and the space to think about things like that. We're looking for things. I mean, the biggest companies in the world today are the companies that help us waste time. Social media, for example, right? That is where we're at, and we're going to be a lot further in that direction in the next couple of years than I would prefer to see. But it is going to be a pretty rapid inflection point in that regard, and we'll see how things change as time goes on. But I think it's going to be very strange at the end of the day.
I totally agree with you, and sadly, I'm disappointed, and I do see what's I like you think capitalism is going to disappear. It is already so shockingly shifted over the past 3 or 4 years since we've gone through this global event, and it's actually quite frightening when you think about that. And I say that knowing that you live in the wokest state in North America, and you're probably seeing it hot, firsthand. There's lots of conversation, what's happening in China in terms of UBI, as well as what they're doing with central bank digital currencies, what they're doing with facial recognition. Some people are just waking up to the fact now, and because I've spent time in China, and we actually have friends, expats that live in China, are keeping us up to date on what they're seeing going on. I mean, it is actually quite shocking and frightening at the same time to understand just how far ahead they are in terms of what we know will eventually come into the Western culture and be absorbed. And it is kind of, I find that a little bit frightening as a grandfather. I'm going, gosh, what are my grandkids destined for? It seems like a battle that just won't ever be won. It's like we're going to have to go through this. Society is going to have to go through this. The useless eaters will probably disappear at some point or have to go. There's all of this narrative that 3 or 4 years ago somebody'd say, "What in the fuck are you talking about?" And now it's like, yeah, no, I can actually see that starting to unfold, and it really is messy. I find both fascinating and frightening at the same time. I'm immersed in the research of it because that's kind of my background, and the team I have is about economic research. But it's easy to go down a different path given we look at the macroeconomics of what we are seeing happen and unfold, these days. Where was I going with that conversation, not much further than that, other than when you look at what you see, again, being in the wokest, state in the country or in North America, what's your thoughts on that? What else are you seeing
Mhm.
from that perspective?
I think that so just so the listener base knows where I fall on that sort of thing. I would say I lean slightly left on social issues. I lean slightly right on economic issues. I definitely don't identify wholeheartedly with one party. I believe, like, more and more each day, I am developing more of a distaste for woke culture because of the fact that it feels like they're battling hate with more hate. I think that it's creating a lot more of an echo chamber. And I think it is kind of a cult like mentality now on the extremes of both sides, where you're choosing a common enemy and choosing to only surround yourself with people who look and think just like you. I think that's incredibly dangerous in terms of it being a healthy societal dynamic. I think it's a threat to innovation. I think it's important to be able to expose yourself to other opinions, to other ways of thinking, however wrong you might think they are, and to engage in those dialogues and be upset by them, be affected by them, be uncomfortable and impacted in some way by them, and let it enliven you and impassion you. Be scared by it, be brought to your knees by it. Like, all those things are fundamental parts of the human condition, and they're also what lead us to being able to evolve in our own perspectives, to see how some of the people who think in different ways think that way, or how they were crafted that way, and those types of things. And I think that because of the primary way we have consumed information over the past 10 years, i.e., advertiser driven television and social media that is monetized in large part by advertising, there's a great book that I always cite here, Contagious by Jonah Berger, and he mentions that the way to have any sort of product or service or business of any kind catch on, it's by catalyzing and building an audience, for example, through catalyzing high arousal emotion in one direction or another, be it fear or elation or hilarity or anger or controversy, things that make us feel very intensely, regardless of the direction of that feeling on the spectrum. Like, that is what drives engagement in a lot of ways. And so those advertiser driven businesses have a direct financial interest in sparking that type of information in, or that type of emotion in us. It also starts to bucketize and like polarize in that same vein. And I think that because of that, a lot of us in society have, unbeknownst to us at the time, have kind of become quasi radicalized. And it's unfortunate to see that be the case, like at the expense of our own psyches and at the expense of society, in service to the dollars in the pockets of those businesses, because I think the science is pretty clear, and how much you engage with those platforms has a direct negative relationship with your own mental health, right?
I agree.
In a society where mental health concerns are at an all-time high, oftentimes seeing that people cope with those emotions by dissociating on those platforms is terrifying. So through that lens, I definitely don't identify with the extremes on either side. I have close friends and family who identify with both, and I love chatting with each of them. I express my agreement and disagreement with both sides on various things. I believe with in a lot of like conservative fiscal policy. I believe in a lot of far left social issues, things like that, and because of that, it's kind of hard to not piss off one side or the other by expressing an authentic opinion that isn't just the same regurgitated cookie cutter mantra of one side or the other.
Yeah, I agree with all that you've said, by the way. And I think probably the challenges we face these days is that there's no such thing, or it seems that's a big statement. It is more difficult than ever to actually have a discussion without things going off the rails one way or the other? Where did we get to a point where we couldn't have a discussion, where we couldn't view or share a view of the world that doesn't align with somebody else's view? And what it seems to have done is actually shut people up. There's a lot of people operating on top of, conversations that they wish they could have, statements that they wish they could make, discussions that they wish they could have, even not even to prove their point, but actually just to talk it out and to hear somebody else's perspective. But, for fear of being trolled or being, shot down or shut up or whatever the term is, those discussions aren't being had. The polarization right around the world globally, and I can speak to Canada to the degree I'm familiar with the U.S. because I've spent time there and I have friends there. You start to realize that the polarization and the divisiveness of society has really gotten extreme. That gap has gotten very, very wide. And when I even look at what's happening politically, I think that is the biggest. When I get charged about something, it's the politics. It is actually the leaders who are not leaders. I don't know the whole quote off the top of my head, but one of the lines is that weak men create hard times, and our leaders are right now very weak, the majority of them by far, and we are facing hard times because of that inability to make decisions, to take a stand for what is the greater good, and it is driven by politics over policy. Those are things that I'm observing, and I can get really fired up about those particular conversations. Culturally, I just see that divide, and it's disheartening.
Yeah, I agree, and I love that quote. The weak people create hard times create strong people create easy times create weak people. Right? Cyclical. And sometimes we are both of those, right? There are times where we are weak through the lens of that particular analogy, and there's sometimes where we're strong. And I agree. And at the end of the day, I think it's also important. Like for me, I'm aware of the advantages that I was innately given. I was born in America in modern times. I was born into a family that did not completely screw me up. We were able to eat all of our meals, and I was encouraged to think. I was not heavily discriminated against in any way growing up. Like I'm aware of all those advantages, and rather than trying to hide from that reality, my intention instead is to just use that in a way that I can make the largest impact on humanity, regardless of their starting point, across the board. And I think that if we try to vilify people because of what their starting point, their innate starting point that they had no control of regardless of what that was, it's a huge mistake. I think there are a lot of advantages from growing up in hardship. I think there are a lot of, taxes that you pay from the same thing, right? And because of that, there are a lot of circumstances. There's a lot of anger that takes place. And I think the question always becomes, like, based on what you've experienced, how are you going to act? How are you going to create change? How are you going to make an impact? And how are you going to influence others? If you got a good answer to all those questions, then you're ahead of the curve in comparison to 99% of society.